My daughter was 3 days old when my mother told me I needed to leave her house. Not suggested, not hinted at, told. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom I had grown up in and said it with the calm of someone who had been rehearsing the words and had finally decided the moment had arrived. "We need the space," she said. "Marcus is coming with the kids. There simply isn't room for everyone." I was sitting on the edge of the bed with Ella in my arms. 3 days old, 6 pounds 4 ounces, sleeping against my chest with the total trusting weight of a person who does not yet know the world, requires anything from her. I looked at my mother. I said, "Where am I supposed to go?" She had an answer ready. She always did. "Your cousin Sandra has a spare room. Or there's the Residence Inn on Maple. We can help with the first week." The first week. I did not cry. People always assume I cried. I did not. I felt something move through me that was not grief and not anger, something older and quieter, something that had been building for a long time and had finally found its shape. I said, "I need a few days to make arrangements." She said, "Of course. We just need the room by the weekend." It was Wednesday. What she did not know, what I did not know yet either, was that 6 years earlier my father had sat down with his attorney and done something very careful and very deliberate with the deed to that house. Something that changed everything she thought she had already decided. My name is Vanessa Cole. I am 28 years old. I grew up in Sacramento, California, in a 4-bedroom house my father built the equity in over 30 years. He died at 62, leaving the house to my mother, or so everyone assumed, including my mother. I have one brother, Marcus. He is 3 years older and has always been louder about his needs than I have been about mine. I live now in Portland, Oregon, in a house with yellow kitchen walls and a back garden that gets afternoon light, and a daughter named Ella who is 14 months old and has recently learned to say the word more, which she applies to everything she wants, which is everything. This is the story of how I got there, all of it, including the part nobody saw coming. Stay with me. My father, Robert Cole, was a civil engineer. He was precise and methodical, and patient in the way of someone who has spent his career making sure that structures built to last actually do. He checked things twice. He planned for contingencies. He left margins for error, not because he expected to make mistakes, but because he understood that the world sometimes did, and he preferred to be prepared. He loved my mother completely. He loved Marcus and me equally, which is what he always said, and what I mostly believed, though Marcus was louder about his needs, and my father was human, and loud needs have a way of getting met first. He died on a Tuesday in October, when I was 22. He was at his desk at work reviewing plans for a bridge project he had been overseeing for 3 years and would never see completed. I flew home from college and sat in my childhood bedroom for 4 days, while relatives came and went, and my mother moved through the house with the exhausted efficiency of someone managing a situation rather than grieving a person. She cleared his closet within a month. She converted his study to a sewing room. She made decisions about the house with the quiet authority of someone who had been waiting to make them without negotiation. I went back to college and tried not to examine too closely what the speed of those changes meant. In the years after my father died, my mother's preference for Marcus became less something I sensed and more something I could document if I had wanted to. His landscaping business struggled in its second year. She lent him money without mentioning it to me, and without offering the same when my own finances were difficult. His wife Denise was welcomed into the family with a warmth I had not realized my mother was capable of until I saw her directed at someone else. His twin boys Jackson and Theo became the organizing principle of her life. I watched from a respectful distance and tried to feel only happiness about it. I mostly succeeded. My own life had taken a different shape. I moved to Portland at 24 for a teaching position and stayed because Portland suited me. I liked the rain. I liked the coffee and the bookstores and the particular culture of a city that takes those things seriously. I was in a relationship for 3 years with a man named David who was kind and ultimately wanted to live near his family in Boston. We ended things without bitterness, and I do not have a bad word to say about him. I became pregnant at 27. The father was a graphic designer named Paul who was thoughtful and who said all the right things immediately when I told him, and then said fewer and fewer of them over the following weeks. When I was 11 weeks along, he told me he did not think he was ready for this. I told him I understood. I decided to continue the pregnancy alone. I made that decision carefully and with full awareness of what it required, and I have not regretted it for a single day. Which does not mean it has been easy. I called my mother to tell her. She said she was happy for me and would do whatever she could to help. She said it warmly. 3 months later, when my lease was ending and managing a newborn alone in a one-bedroom apartment felt genuinely overwhelming, I called her again. I asked if I could come home for a few months. Just until I found my footing. Just until Ella was sleeping in predictable stretches, and I had figured out childcare and going back to work. She said, of course. She said the house had plenty of room. It did have plenty of room, until it didn't. Marcus and Denise had been having problems for 2 years. I knew this the way you know things in families. Not from direct conversation, but from careful silences around certain topics. The way my mother's voice shifted when Denise's name came up. A comment Marcus made at Christmas about needing space that nobody followed up on because following up would have required acknowledging something. What I did not know, until my mother appeared in my doorway 3 days after I came home from the hospital, was that the problems had resolved themselves in a specific direction. Marcus and Denise were separating. He needed somewhere stable for the boys. That somewhere was my mother's house. And the room he needed was the one I was in. Why is a 31-year-old man with a business moving into your house? I asked. He needs his family right now, my mother said. I looked down at Ella. I thought, so do I. I didn't say it out loud. I have spent a significant portion of my life not saying the things I should have said. This was one more occasion on which that habit served no one well, including me. I said, okay, a few days. She said, the weekend. And she left. I called my best friend Nicole that night after Ella was asleep. Nicole had known me since we were both first-year teachers and had the gift of listening without immediately trying to fix things. I told her everything. The doorway, the residence inn, the first week. When I finished, she said, Vanessa, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know yet. She said, can I say something? I said, yes. She said, you went home to be helped. And the first thing that happened was someone told you to leave. I want you to really hear that, because I think you're going to minimize it. She was right. I was already minimizing it. Finding the explanations that made it more complicated than it was, and less clear than it was. Because complicated was easier than sitting with what it actually meant. What it meant was, my mother had a choice between her daughter, with a 3-day-old baby, and her son going through a separation. She made the choice in the time it took to appear in a doorway and rehearse a sentence. Nicole said, where will you actually go? I said, I need to make some calls in the morning. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of Ella, who slept in 3-hour stretches that I was learning to be grateful for. Because I kept thinking about something I had never properly thought about before. I had never once asked to see my father's will. I had been 22 and grieving, and my mother had handled everything, and I had trusted that. For 6 years I had trusted that. But my father was a civil engineer. He checked things twice. He planned for contingencies. He had loved me. And I suddenly, lying in the dark in the bedroom I grew up in, was not sure I understood what he had actually left behind. The next morning I made one call. Not to a hotel, not to my cousin Sandra, to Franklin Webb, my father's attorney. I had his number saved in my phone from the period after my father died. I had never called it. Something made me call it now. His receptionist answered. I gave my name. There was a brief pause. Then Franklin came to the phone himself. He said, Vanessa, I was wondering when I might hear from you. I said, why were you wondering that? A longer pause, he said. I think we should meet in person. Are you available tomorrow morning? I said yes. And the feeling in my chest that I had been carrying since the doorway shifted into something I still did not have a name for, but which felt, for the first time in 3 days, like something other than loss. I drove to Franklin's office the next morning with Ella in her car seat. Franklin Webb was 70 years old and looked exactly like a man who had spent his career keeping other people's secrets until the right moment arrived to stop keeping them. White hair, careful handshake, an office full of files organized in a system only he fully understood. He shook my hand, he looked at Ella with genuine warmth. He offered me coffee, he poured himself water. Then he sat down and folded his hands. And he said, "Your father came to see me 6 months before he died." I waited. He said he made some changes to his estate planning. Your mother is aware of them. You were not told at the time because your father felt the right moment hadn't arrived. I said, "What kind of changes?" Franklin looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Vanessa, before I show you these documents, I want to ask you something. In the past few days, has anything happened that made you feel like you needed to understand your father's estate better?" I thought about the doorway. I thought about Wednesday, the weekend, the residence inn, the first week. I said, "Yes." He nodded slowly. He said, "Your father thought something like this might happen eventually. He didn't know the specific shape of it, but he knew the general shape of who your mother was under pressure. And he wanted to make sure you were protected." He opened the folder on his desk, and he slid a document across the table. I looked at it, and I understood, slowly, and then all at once, why my father had been an engineer. Because engineers do not build structures that depend on the goodness of the people inside them. They build structures that hold regardless. My father had left the house to both of us. Not to my mother outright. To my mother as a life estate, meaning she had the right to live there for the rest of her life. But the underlying ownership, the deed, the equity, the right to determine what happened to the property after her lifetime, had been left in equal shares, 50% to Marcus, 50% to me. My mother could not sell the house without our consent. She could not mortgage it beyond what was already in place without our involvement. And she could not require one of the co-inheritors of the property to vacate it in order to make room for the other. Franklin said this last part carefully and precisely, the way my father would have. I sat in that office with my 6-pound 4-ounce daughter on my lap, and I thought about my father at his desk, on the last Tuesday of his life, and I understood something I had not understood before. He had known. Not the specific shape of what would happen, not the doorway or the 3 days old part or the residence inn, but the general shape, who my mother was when she had to choose, who she tended to choose, what that might eventually mean for me. He had built a structure, not to punish anyone, not because he didn't love my mother, but because he understood that the people we love are not always their best selves under pressure, and he preferred to be prepared. I looked at Franklin. I said, "Does my mother know about this?" He said, "She was present when the documents were signed. She understood what they meant." I said, "Then why did she tell me to leave?" Franklin looked at me for a long moment. He said, "I believe she assumed you didn't know, and that you wouldn't find out until it was too late to matter." I drove back to my mother's house. My mother's house? Which was also in the specific legal sense that my father had made certain of 6 months before he died, my house. Ella was asleep in her car seat. The afternoon light was coming through the trees at the particular angle it gets in October in Sacramento, golden and slightly long. The light that always made me feel something when I was a child, that I didn't have language for until I was older, and realized it was the feeling of home. I sat in the driveway for several minutes. Then I carried Ella inside, settled her in the bassinet, and went to find my mother. She was in the kitchen making tea. She looked up when I came in. I said, "I met with Franklin Webb this morning." Her expression did not collapse. It did something more controlled. It rearranged itself, the way a hand of cards gets rearranged when someone realizes they have been playing the wrong game. She said, "I see." I said, "I think we need to talk about the house." She turned back to the kettle. After a long moment she said, "Your father was very thorough." I said, "He was." The kettle boiled. She poured 2 cups without asking if I wanted one, and set one in front of the chair across from her and sat down. I sat down too. And we began. The conversation at that kitchen table was the longest and most honest one my mother and I had ever had. It did not go well at first. She said things I had heard before in different forms. She had only been trying to keep the peace. Marcus was going through something genuinely difficult. She hadn't meant it the way it sounded. She had assumed I would understand. I let her say all of it. Then I said, "Mom, I came home 3 days ago with a newborn. You asked me to leave by the weekend. I need you to hear how that actually landed, not how you meant it to land." She was quiet. I said, "I'm not going anywhere. Not because I want to make things difficult, because Dad made sure I didn't have to." She looked at her tea. She said, "He didn't tell me he was going to do that." I said, "He told you when he did it. Franklin said you were there." She looked up, and for a moment her face did something I had not seen it do in a very long time. It dropped the management of itself. It just looked tired. She said, "I thought you'd always be fine. You've always been the one who figures things out." I said, "And Marcus wouldn't figure things out." She didn't answer, which was its own answer. The days that followed the kitchen table conversation were not easy. My mother and I had said true things to each other that we had both been carrying for a long time, and true things have a way of making the air heavier before it gets lighter. She was quieter than usual at breakfast. I was more careful than usual at dinner. We moved around each other in the house with the particular care of 2 people who have said too much and are now deciding what to do with what they said. Ella helped without knowing she was helping. My mother held her in the mornings while I showered and ate. She sat with her in the afternoons when I was too exhausted to keep my eyes open. She sang to her in the specific off-key way she had always sung to Marcus and me when we were small, a habit I had completely forgotten about until I heard it again. I watched my mother hold my daughter, and I tried to hold 2 things at once: what she had done, and who she also was. Some days I managed it, some days I didn't, but I kept trying. Marcus called me a week after the kitchen table conversation. He said, "Vanessa, I didn't know she asked you to leave." I said, "I believe you." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I told her we'd figure something else out, me and the boys." I said, "Marcus, you don't have to do that." He said, "Yeah, I kind of do." Something in his voice was different from how I remembered it. Quieter, more real. He said, "Can I come over tomorrow? Just to talk." I said yes. He came the next afternoon. He held Ella for 45 minutes on the back porch while we talked more honestly than we had talked since we were teenagers. He told me that things with Denise had been deteriorating for longer than anyone knew, that the boys were confused and he was trying to shield them, that he had called Mom in a moment of panic and she had immediately said, "Come home," and he had not thought through what that meant for anyone else. I said, "She didn't ask you what it meant for anyone else. She just decided." He looked at me. He said, "Yeah, she does that." I said, "She does it differently with you than with me." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know. I've known for a long time. I didn't know what to do about it." I said, "You could have said something." He said, "Yeah, I could have." We sat with that for a while. Ella made a small sound in his arms, and he adjusted his hold on her with the comfortable ease of someone who had done this before. Something in me settled slightly watching him. He said, "She looks like Dad." I said, "I think so too." Marcus found a short-term rental 2 miles from my mother's house 3 weeks later. He found it himself without my mother's help, which I think was deliberate. It was close enough for the boys to keep their routines, and far enough for everyone to breathe. I stayed. Not triumphantly, not as a statement. I stayed because I had come home for a reason, and the reason was still true regardless of what had happened in the doorway. I needed support with a newborn. The house had room. My father had made sure I had the right to be there. My mother and I found a kind of functional peace over the weeks that followed. It was not warm at first. It was the peace of 2 people who have decided to be in the same space without revisiting everything that has happened in that space. Some days it was almost comfortable. Some days it required more than either of us had readily available. But we kept trying. 6 weeks after the kitchen table conversation, my mother came to find me in the back garden. I was sitting with Ella in the afternoon light. She sat down in the other chair. She said, "I want to say something and I need you to let me finish before you respond." I said, "Okay." She said, "What I did was wrong, not complicated, not understandable given the circumstances." "Wrong?" She said, "You came home with a 3-day-old baby, and I told you to leave, and I had reasons I believed at the time, and none of them were good enough." She looked at her hands. She said, "I have spent a long time treating your brother like he needed more from me than you did. Partly because he asked for more. Partly because it was easier. Partly because your father used to balance it, and when he was gone, I didn't notice how far the balance had shifted until it was already very far." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I noticed when I saw your face in that doorway. I just didn't stop. I looked at Ella. Then I looked at my mother. I said, 'Why are you telling me this now?' She said, 'Because Franklin called me. He wanted to make sure I understood that you knew your rights. And I realized I had been hoping you didn't. And I didn't like what that said about me.' I sat with that for a long time. The October light was doing the thing it does, long and golden through the trees. I said, 'I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen.' She said, 'I'm not asking you to.' I said, 'But I don't want to spend the rest of our lives not coming back from it either.' She looked at me. She said, 'Neither do I.' We sat in the garden until the light changed. It was not a resolution, but it was a beginning. And sometimes a beginning is the most honest thing two people can offer each other. I went back to Portland in March. Ella was 5 months old. She was sleeping in 5-hour stretches and had strong opinions about the mobile above her changing table, which she disapproved of, and about being carried facing outward so she could see things, which she strongly approved of. I had found childcare that would work when I went back to teaching in September. I had found a new apartment. 1 bedroom, but with a proper second room, better light than the old place, a landlord who allowed large dogs, which mattered, because Nicole had one she brought over often. My mother helped me pack. She offered. I accepted. She came to Portland with me for the first 4 days to help me settle. She slept on the air mattress in the second room. In the mornings, she held Ella while I had coffee. In the evenings, she cooked things I had not eaten since I was small and had forgotten I missed. On her last evening, she sat at my kitchen table and looked around the apartment. She said, "It suits you." I said, "I think so." She said, "Your father would have liked Portland. All those bridges." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed about my father without it hurting first. She smiled. She said, "Ella is going to be something." I said, "She already is." She left the next morning. I stood on the sidewalk and watched her get into the rideshare, and I felt several things at once that I am still sorting out. Relief, gratitude, grief for the version of us that might have been, hope, small and tentative, for the version of us that might still become something better than what we had been. I think about my father often, about what he understood when he sat down with Franklin 6 months before he died, and made the changes he made. He understood that my mother loved Marcus and me differently, even if she would never have said so. He understood that his presence in the family created a balance that would not hold without him. He understood that I was the child who would be fine according to everyone's assumptions, which meant I was the child most likely to end up not fine, because I would be last to be looked after. And he understood that he could not change any of those things from inside his life, but he could do something about them from outside it. He left me half a house, not as a statement, not as a punishment, not as a correction, as a structure, the way engineers build structures, to carry a load, to hold something up, to make sure that if the people inside made decisions that were wrong, there would be something in the walls that held anyway. I think about him at his desk on that last Tuesday. The bridge plans, the careful margins he left, the contingencies he planned for. He was precise, he was methodical. He checked things twice. He loved me in the way that means something when you need it to mean something. That is enough. That is more than enough. Ella said her first word at 11 months. Not mama. More. I was in the kitchen making oatmeal, and she was in her high chair watching me with the focused attention she brings to everything. She looked directly at me and said more. Clearly. Twice. Then looked very pleased with herself. I stood in my yellow-walled kitchen in Portland, Oregon, and I laughed until I cried. Then I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring. She said her first word. She said, "What was it?" I said, "More." There was a pause. Then my mother laughed. A real laugh. The one I remembered from before my father died. The one that came from somewhere genuine. She said, "Of course it was." I said, "I know." She said, "She sounds like you." I said, "She sounds like her." We talked for 40 minutes. About Ella and Portland and Marcus and the boys, and a trip my mother was thinking of taking to New Mexico. Ordinary things. In the easy way of two people who have decided to keep trying. When we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a while. The afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle I had learned to love. Different from the Sacramento light. Different season. Different latitude. Different slant. But still light. Still enough to see by. Still enough to find your way home. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. What would you have done if you were Vanessa? Would you have confronted your mother or walked away? Subscribe. New story every week. Every single one earns its ending.